Imagine a powerful politician stepping onto foreign soil, expecting a warm welcome, only to face a crowd of protesters shouting for him to leave. JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, traveled to Greenland to strengthen America's presence in the Arctic. Instead, he found himself at the center of a firestorm, with locals holding signs that read, "Yankee Go Home," their voices echoing through the snowy landscape. His response to the humiliation left everyone, protesters, politicians, and even his own team speechless, revealing a powerful lesson about resilience and the importance of listening. JD Vance's trip to Greenland came at a time when the Arctic was becoming a geopolitical hotspot. The region's ice is melting, opening new shipping routes and exposing vast resources like oil, gas, and rare earth minerals. Russia and China have been expanding their influence there, with Russia building up its military presence and China investing in resource exploration. The United States couldn't afford to fall behind. Greenland, a self-governing territory of Denmark, holds a key position in this struggle. It's home to the Pacific Space Base, a critical U.S. military installation used for missile warning systems, space surveillance, and Arctic operations. Vance's visit was meant to reinforce America's commitment to the region, particularly through its military presence at Pacific, and the plan was for Vance to visit the base, meet with U.S. troops, and deliver a speech emphasizing the importance of the U.S.-Denmark-Greenland partnership. His delegation included his wife, JD Vance, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, Energy Secretary Chris Wright, and Senator Mike Lee, all there to show a united front. But the trip wasn't just about the military. Vance's team had also arranged for him to attend cultural events, like a dog-sled race in Nuuk, two of Greenland's largest towns. The goal was to connect with the local people, show respect for their traditions, and build goodwill in a region where the U.S. has a complicated history. Decades ago, the U.S. displaced an indigenous community, the Inuit, to build the Pacific base, a decision that left deep scars among Greenland. Many still view the American presence with suspicion, and Vance's team hoped a public visit might help ease those tensions. Greenlanders, however, had a very different reaction. When word of Vance's visit spread, local leaders were outraged. They hadn't been consulted about the itinerary, and they saw the trip as a publicity stunt, a chance for Vance to use their homeland for political gain. Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen publicly criticized the visit, calling it disrespectful. The local population shared his frustration. They felt ignored by a foreign power that seemed more interested in its own agenda than in their concerns. Protests were organized quickly. In Nuuk, groups planned to turn their backs on Vance's motorcade as it passed through. In Sisimiut, others prepared to march with signs and banners. One banner stood out, a large white sheet with the words, "Yankee Go Home," written in bold, black letters, a skull drawn next to the text for emphasis. The protests reflected deeper frustrations. Greenlanders have long felt caught between Denmark, their colonial overseer, and the U.S., a military giant with a base on their land. Many want independence, but they also want respect, something they believe neither country has fully given them. Vance, to them, represented everything they were pushing back against: foreign interference, disregard for their autonomy, and a history of being treated as a pawn in larger geopolitical games. The tension in Greenland grew as Vance's arrival approached. Snow covered the ground, but the air was heavy with anger. Vance's team learned of the protests and realized the cultural events were a mistake. They canceled the dog-sled race appearances and other public engagements, hoping to avoid a public relations disaster. The new plan was for Vance to fly into Pacific Space Base, spend a few hours with the troops, and leave. It was a scaled-back visit, but even that couldn't stop the backlash. When Vance's plane landed, he stepped onto the tarmac, bundled in a heavy coat, his delegation by his side. He was briefed on the base's operations, posed for photos with the troops, and prepared to deliver his speech. Outside the base's gates, however, a crowd of protesters had gathered. The protesters stood in the snow, their breath visible in the cold air. They held up their signs, the Yankee Go Home banner prominently displayed, and chanted slogans in Greenlandic and English. Some waved the Greenlandic flag, its white and red design standing out against the snowy backdrop. Their message was unmistakable: Vance wasn't welcome. News cameras captured the scene, and the images spread quickly online. Social media platforms lit up with posts from Greenlanders and their supporters, many calling Vance's visit an insult. A local business, Tupalak Travel, had already refused to host JD Vance, saying they didn't want to be part of a political spectacle. The rejection was public, and it was humiliating for Vance, a man accustomed to commanding respect. Inside the base, Vance delivered his speech to the troops. He praised their service, highlighted the importance of the U.S. presence in the Arctic, and criticized Denmark for neglecting Greenland's security. His words were meant to assert America's role in the region, but they only added fuel to the fire outside. Greenland's Prime Minister Nielsen called the remarks highly aggressive, accusing Vance of disrespecting their sovereignty. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen agreed, saying Vance's tone was unacceptable. The visit, intended to strengthen alliances, was instead creating new tensions. As Vance finished his speech and prepared to leave, his team informed him of the protests. They advised him to ignore the crowd, board the plane, and return to Washington. The situation was too volatile. They warned. Vance, however, made a different choice. He asked to speak with the protesters. His team was taken aback. The Secret Service raised concerns about security, but Vance insisted he wanted to face the crowd and hear their grievances, even if it meant walking into a hostile environment. Against his advisors' recommendations, JD Vance stepped outside the base's gates, accompanied by security but otherwise alone. The protesters quieted for a moment, surprised by his presence. Then the chants resumed, louder than before. "Yankee Go Home," they shouted, waving their signs. Vance stood there, taking in the scene, his expression calm. He raised a hand, not in defiance, but to signal he wanted to speak. Then he addressed the crowd in a way that no one anticipated. "I hear you," Vance said, his voice steady but not confrontational. "I understand your anger, and I see why you feel this way. I'm not here to disrespect you or your home. I'm here because I believe we can work together. But I realize we've started off poorly. I apologize for that." The crowd grew quieter, some lowering their signs, others exchanging glances. Vance continued, "I didn't come to Greenland to make enemies. I came to learn, to listen, and to build something better. If I've failed at that, I need to do better. Tell me what you need, and I'll listen." The snowy landscape fell silent. The protesters, who had been prepared to shout him down, were unsure how to respond. This wasn't the reaction they had expected from a man they viewed as a symbol of American arrogance. Vance didn't try to defend himself or argue. He didn't revisit his earlier comments about Denmark. Instead, he stood in the cold, listening as a few protesters began to speak. A woman holding the Yankee Go Home banner stepped forward. She spoke about the Inuit, her ancestors, who were forced from their homes to make way for the base Vance had just visited. She described the lack of respect, the feeling of being invisible to the world's superpowers. Others added their voices, sharing fears about resource exploitation, their desire for independence, and their frustration with being caught in geopolitical games. Vance listened without interrupting. He nodded, his expression serious, taking in every word. When the woman finished, he thanked her for sharing her perspective. He promised to raise her concerns with his team and to push for more dialogue between the U.S. and Greenland's leaders. He admitted he didn't have all the answers, but committed to doing better. Then, without making a scene, he turned and walked back to his plane. The protesters watched him leave, some still holding their signs, others talking quietly among themselves. The chants didn't start again. The anger remained, but something had changed. When Vance returned to Washington, the reaction was swift. News outlets covered the event extensively, describing Vance's response as a rare moment of humility. From a politician known for his strong rhetoric, on social media, opinions were split. Some praised Vance for facing the protesters directly, calling it a courageous act. Others dismissed it as a calculated move to save face after a failed visit. In Greenland, however, the impact was significant. Prime Minister Nielsen, who had been highly critical of Vance, later acknowledged his willingness to listen, softening his stance. The Danish government, while still upset about Vance's earlier remarks, noted that his actions outside the base showed a willingness to engage. For Vance, the visit marked a shift. He came back to the U.S. with a deeper understanding of the complexities of international relations and the importance of listening. Before speaking, he followed through on his promise, setting up a task force to address Greenland's concerns about the Pacific base and advocating for more direct communication with Greenlandic leaders. The trip, which had begun with tension, became a moment of growth for Vance and a reminder of the power of humility. The events in Greenland highlight a universal truth. When faced with rejection or criticism, the instinct is often to retreat, fight back, or ignore the opposition. But there's another way: to listen, to acknowledge mistakes, and to show up, even when it's difficult. Vance didn't win over every protester, and he didn't solve Greenland's challenges. But by standing in the snow, facing the anger directly, and choosing to listen over reacting, he demonstrated what it means to grow through adversity. It's a reminder for everyone. When challenges arise, facing them with humility and a willingness to learn can lead to unexpected growth and understanding.